And welcome to Angular Air. I'm here today with Oliver
Hey,
and Amy,
Hello.
and we're joined today by a special guest, Niall Crosby.
Hello.
A couple of quick announcements, and then we'll get started talking to Niall. First of all, Kent is out today. He just had his third child, so we all congratulate Kent and wish him the best of luck, and hopefully he gets some sleep. Don't forget to tweet NGAir question if you have any questions throughout the show, and we'll cover those right near the end. And then finally, next show, next week, same time on Tuesday, is going to be with Minko Gitchev talking about immutability in Angular 1. So we're all looking forward to that. Okay, so we're here today with Niall Crosby, as we mentioned, who is the creator of a library called agGrid. So Niall, why don't you introduce yourself and give us a little bit of background of what agGrid is.
Sure. Thanks, Jeff. My name is Niall Crosby. I'm living in London. I've been writing software for about 16, 17 years now professionally. And I've been doing web applications with JavaScript and Angular for about 3 years. During that time, I've built, I'd say, about 4 large products end-to-end. And for each of those, we had a grid was a core part of that system. So I felt the pain in choosing a decent grid to be used inside AngularJS. We started off, like I guess everybody else, we used ngGrid, which was okay. It was okay for small grids. But once we started to put in advanced features like, say, grouping or pinning, and then especially when we went to put in many columns into our grids, we found that ngGrid just wasn't able to handle the sort of things we were throwing at it. So we looked around. We decided on JQXGrid. We were using that happily for about a year. One of the things I didn't like about JQXGrid was that it was quite clunky. If you had 4 grids on different tabs, and as you're going through the tabs, it went clunk, 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 clunk. And then I was coming towards Christmas last year, and we had a system that had just gone into production, and it was with JQXGrid. One of the things that's really frustrating as a developer is when you know you've done your job well, and then when the product gets released, the experience from the users is, actually, we don't like it because it's too clunky, and that was nothing to do with the code that we did. It was just down to the grid choice. So we couldn't go back to agGrid, but I knew UIGrid was on the horizon, which was going to be the solution to a good grid in AngularJS. So I was really looking forward to UIGrid being released. And when the beta came out, I think it was November last year, I quickly put that in and try and solve our problems. But it didn't do very well. When we put a big grid with 60 columns in and we tried to scroll from the left to the right, it just fell down. It would just stall for about 15 seconds as it tried to render. And it also had a lot of bugs, which, okay, I can appreciate it's in beta, you're going to have bugs, but these bugs were things where it just showed sloppy kind of code base where you would scroll from right to left, and when you scroll to the left, the columns wouldn't be aligned. Just little strange things were happening. It was broken. So I was quite frustrated. We couldn't use SlickGrid because SlickGrid didn't allow pinned columns, and I was looking for a solution that would fit into Angular and fit into native JavaScript applications better without going through jQuery or without going through the DOM, but a direct interface. I wanted methods that I could call, not have to go through the divs that the items were attached to. So I was wondering, how hard can it be? Because SlickGrid shows that JavaScript can be really fast. You can have row virtualization and get things to go really, really well. But for some reason, there was a blocker. There wasn't a grid which you could plug into AngularJS that worked fast and then had stuff that I wanted, which was grouping, pinning, and I also wanted Excel-like filtering. And I didn't see any grid which would have that simple thing built in where you'd click on the top of the column and it would show you the 20 or so values, and you could check the checkboxes. That just didn't seem to come in any of the grids. So I took it as a mini project to myself over the Christmas period to give it a bash, see if I could come up with something so when it came into work after Christmas, I could then plug it into the application and see if it would work. So that's why I started agGrid. Back then I called it AngularGrid, but I changed the name recently to differentiate it from UIGrid because some people are getting them mixed up. And brought it into work, and it worked really well. I can firmly say from that day forwards, all of my grid stress issues went away. So for me, I finally had a grid which did the things which I needed them to do. I wrote a grid myself over Christmas, or at least the core part of it was written over Christmas. So I released it as open source, but I didn't push it. But after about 2 months, people were saying to me, this is actually really good. If you push this, it could become used better or by other people. A few people contacted me through GitHub and told me to found my grid. They don't understand why it isn't taking off. But the reason why it wasn't really taking off is because I wasn't trying. It wasn't my intention at the time to release it as a grid into the AngularJS ecosystem. So that's when I decided to put the website together. I put the documentation together. I wrote the article, Why the World Needed another AngularJS grid, and I pushed it onto Reddit on April 1st, and it almost went viral straight away. Lots of people started using the grid. And then to my surprise, and I was really surprised with this, not only was the response very positive, but a lot of people had the same problems as I had. There seemed to be a general aggravation in the community for the lack of a decent grid inside AngularJS, which kind of surprised me a bit, because when you're building a framework, usually a good grid is at the core of that framework. So for it to have gone on for so long in the AngularJS world without having a very solid enterprise level decent grid to build the applications on, I found that a bit surprising. That's the story of where the grid came from and kind of where it is going from now. From that day forwards, I've been doing two things. I've been enhancing the grid for myself, for my work, and also enhancing it for the community as well. So I've started to put in features which were not specifically for me, but for things that other people have asked for, like pagination and virtual scrolling, which is not actually stuff that I use.
So one thing that's interesting with what you kind of went over is that there's kind of an underlying thing said of some of the use cases. Basically, when you have like a lot of data, can you get into a little bit of that, of like, what are the business, like from a business perspective, like why you would come about using a product like agGrid or any grid solution? Is it just because the business wants to see a lot of data, structured data on the page at the same time, or are there other use cases as well?
Yeah, that's very dependent on where you're coming from. For me, I work in banking. I work with a lot of finance products. So we're not delivering web pages in the traditional sense. I think that AngularJS was designed for. So we're delivering in-house products. So our users expect an Excel-like experience within a browser on the desktop. So they want to be able to load in 100,000 records or 50,000 records, slice and dice, search, and then us as developers, we want to be able to present that to them, but then modify the data. So change the colors, move it around, allow a nice interface, put the filtering in, and have it all easy to work with. But you don't need to have large amounts of data in order to benefit from the grid, because although that's one of the differentiators is it does work really fast and manages large data, it also has a very clean interface into it. So changing the grid, changing its behavior, doing cell rendering, all of that is done very nicely as well. So even if your grid data requirements are low, you can still benefit from the clean API and the other things it has.
Yeah, so I'm using it at work, and we have quite a lot of rows on some of our datasets, and we have one table that has something like 100 or maybe 150 lines, and we started using agGrid because nothing else was performant enough, and I was really surprised when I enabled the filter and I clicked on one column and it just filtered in immediately with more than 100 rows. I don't know how you do that.
Yeah, that is pretty cool. A lot of people come back to me with that, and also the quick filter to be able to just type in Sophie and it takes your 100,000 rows down almost instantaneously. It's nice. It's nice.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you for that. Know that you mentioned that you were working on features for the community. Do you have any new features in your mind that you're working on, maybe, or that you will implement soon? Or maybe what are the most requested?
Well, the most requested and what I do are different things. I try and balance it. Sometimes the most requested I don't agree with. For the last couple of weeks, I've been very deep with Angular 2 and web components. It's going to help me back from putting new features in. As of last weekend, I have the first version of the grid working with Angular 2, but I still have a few more days of work to put all the things in which I want to get complete. My hope is, well, not my hope, my target will be, say, in 5 weeks from now, I'll have a grid which completely works outside of a framework, completely works inside AngularJS as it does now, completely works inside Angular 2, which will be tricky because that's not released yet, and completely works as a web component. And then I'm going to try and mix it up a bit and use it as a web component inside Angular 2 as opposed to having it as an Angular 2 component.
Now, with what you just said, you're saying that the same set of code, or you would have two different versions?
The same set of code, which is actually what it's in. The release I did just 2 days ago, the same release of code will work in Angular 1 and in Angular 2 as native, well, directive for Angular 1, and it's a native component in Angular 2.
Okay, so is there any dependencies on Angular at all?
It depends on what you would like. So if you want to use the grid in its core form, it will work with no dependency. But then if you put some Angular bindings inside your own cell rendering, it won't work. So I guess that's where my grid is different to all the other grids, where they have wrappers around them which allow them to connect in with AngularJS. I go a step further and I have the cell rendering work with AngularJS. So if you put the bindings in, then those bindings will work as well. So if you want the fastest grid, then just put Angular to a side. If you want to still, you might have directives you want to use, or maybe you're just more used to using AngularJS and performance isn't an issue for you because your data set is small. If you're of that camp, then you just turn the switch on and then you got full access to AngularJS inside the grid. And I don't know of any other grid that does that. Maybe if you guys have heard, you can tell me, but as far as I'm concerned, no other grid does that.
No, I don't know. And so, yeah, maybe we didn't say that you can use agGrid without Angular. You don't have to, you can use it in another project if you want.
That's right, yeah, and that's the way things are going to go. And I really like one of the changes they've done in AngularJS 2. AngularJS 2 is designed to work with web components. And if you think about it, all of those AngularJS 1 libraries can't be used outside of AngularJS 1. And to me, that's not good, and it's not healthy for AngularJS as an ecosystem. What we need is for developers like ourselves to be able to choose a framework, and then separately on top of that, then choose your components, and they shouldn't be dependent on each other. So if you're in a company and you use AngularJS and you get deep with the grid, and then you go someplace else and they're using a different framework, you won't be able to take those grid components with you and apply them elsewhere. So that dependency shouldn't be there. Web components is a move in that direction. So all of these, all of the difficult components, what is it? The word difficult probably wrong. All of the components that do intense work with the DOM, it's probable that they're so specialized, like a grid that does virtualization, they're so specialized that they shouldn't be using AngularJS, because AngularJS is designed for managing forms on web pages, and then doing a lot of other stuff as well, but the binding and the services, they're all mapped towards writing those types of applications. So the problems that I had to solve, I couldn't really use what AngularJS gave me, such as I've got my own virtual DOM working underneath the hood, I've got the row virtualization, there's a lot of stuff going on there, and I found out working directly with the DOM is the best way to go. So I think the future, what will happen, is these types of components will be represented as web components. You, as an AngularJS application developer, should not be concerned with how those components work underneath the hood. So in my case, in agGrid, it just so happens that it's direct JavaScript and I've got no further dependencies. As far as you're concerned, you can use it as a web component or as an AngularJS component and just hook it up with the events and with the API that I provide. And then in Angular 2, it'll, like what I'm doing at Angular 1, it'll work with the digest cycle or whatever the digest cycle is called in Angular 2 as well, and that'll all work seamlessly. So it's the way to go. Components of the future shouldn't be tied to frameworks.
So I was going to ask a question as you were kind of talking about how Angular Grid is actually working. So you wrote an interesting blog post, and I think people should go read about the different things that you tried on your Christmas break. So first question was if you wanted to kind of talk about the different approaches you tried. And then I also thought it was kind of interesting. So a lot of people, when they hit this wall, have turned to looking at something like React and actually incorporating that in their Angular application, but that wasn't something you looked at. So those are my two questions I was curious about.
Yeah, sure. So the first question, the different strategies that I tried to make the grid really fast. I like to program computer games in the JavaScript world. That's done using the canvas. And I know that computer games are really fast. When you're talking about games, you're talking about 50 frames per second. The scrolling experience should be really, really good. So I just did some Canvas 2D programming. I had to implement my own version of a scroll bar because you can't use the native scroll because native scroll would scroll a div element, which is not what I wanted to do. I wanted to create my own scroll bar, and then based on the scroll position, I would redraw the scene just the same way as we would draw a game. That was almost just a hobby. I wanted to have an idea as to how fast it would be. But I never really believed I'd bring that to fruition because I knew that would be difficult to bring into the enterprise because that skill set of Canvas just isn't with a typical organization. So then my second one was SVG. And again, I didn't believe it would work, but I wanted to try. I wanted to make sure that I didn't miss anything. So I created a grid with SVG. It didn't look very well. It was basically squares with text inside the squares. But it was kind of interesting, and I'm happy I spent time on it, so I didn't miss anything. Maybe there was some nugget of gold in there I was going to discover, but it didn't happen. The next one I was trying then was just take Angular as it is, take the Angular cookbook and build the grid like an Angular application. So that meant use directives to componentize the application underneath, and then use Angular services. The Angular services didn't really suit me because they're all singletons, and the services that I have inside the grid do work with the DOM. So I didn't really see a fit for how Angular presents its services and how I wanted to use the services. I needed them to be working with the DOM and I needed them to be on singletons. But the directives, they added a layer of what I perceived to be unnecessary kind of sugar around what I was trying to do. Because I wasn't doing what directives were really intended for, I ended up writing more code than I needed to get to do the actual things. And it also ended up in more elements in the DOM. And I had to work really hard to kind of get those down because you can only have one element with a child scope, I think. So if you're using interpolation, is that the word, on a different div element, you can only have one element do that. So I was finding there was too many elements kind of stacking up in each other. I kind of got the idea it was too much work and I wasn't really getting benefit from AngularJS, and then that's when I just kind of decided, as a trial, let's just put AngularJS to the side. Let's just do this without AngularJS, and I'll call AngularJS when I need it. So the default position was, let's do this in JavaScript, and when I need AngularJS, I'll give it a call. And that's what became the first version of agGrid. I'm sorry, I was trying to think of your second question. Then I didn't go down the React route for, well, two reasons. First is I didn't need to. When I had developed this grid, it was really, really fast. The performance problem was solved. I didn't see any benefit. And when there's no benefit, then you shouldn't take on an extra stack. So React isn't simple. And you don't want to be doing AngularJS and React at the same time because then it'd be more difficult to hire people that'll be able to do all these things across the stack. But then a second reason, which is quite interesting, is a few months later, I did put a lot of work into making the grid go even faster because I realized there were some concerns on IE. And unfortunately, in my business, IE is very common on the desktop inside corporations. And I did some experiments. One of the experiments is I created my own virtual DOM. So rather than creating I was accessing the DOM directly, and rather than hitting the DOM for every change, rather than creating each cell and putting in the different bits and setting the CSS and attaching them to each other, I was doing a lot of that. So instead I created my own DOM, my own virtual DOM, which had its own levels of composition. And then when the row was ready to put into the browser, I would call toString on that, and it would give me the HTML to insert inside the browser. I still have that inside my grid, but what amazed me was I did some performance tests, and that made zero difference on Chrome. To me, in my grid, which I think is a good example of doing a lot of DOM work, the virtual DOM pattern didn't change anything. It made it the same. Same in Firefox. There was no change. In IE, it did take it down about 25%, which was, I was hoping it to destroy IE. I was hoping it to bring it down. I was hoping to make it like go 5 times faster or 6 or 10 times faster, but it didn't. Just shaved a bit off in IE, but not the others. So I am wondering if people think React is fast just because AngularJS is slow.
Well,
I'm not convinced.
I think there's actually been some good blog posts on that, and it's interesting your experience there because it reflects sort of what I've seen with other similar experiments that not only I've done, but people like Gleb and some others have run, where when you really are focused on performance and you're trying to tune whatever you're working on, you can typically get it to run just as fast as anything else because it's all JavaScript, right? So like you can, any like little hurdles you can kind of go over. I think the thing that people run into is like out of the box, like with Angular 1 there are some pitfalls, and that's sort of where a lot of that comes from, something we've talked about in the past. But it is interesting your approach where you kind of went almost completely outside Angular and just like raw JavaScript, it sounds like, with a lot of the implementation of agGrid, right?
Yeah, yeah.
That's cool. That makes it easier to migrate to Angular 2 as well.
Yeah, definitely. Angular 2 and also web components. Mm-hmm.
So one thing in particular with what you went over is that I don't think you talked about specifically, but when you talk about the different types of things for performance that you implemented, one common use case with grids like is kind of an infinite scrolling. Like you have data and you're kind of just continuously scrolling down with that data. And is that something that is implemented in agGrid? And if it is, what did you do to make it performant and make it not like kill your memory?
Okay, so you're talking about one of the things is virtual scrolling, which is where you only render the rows which are in the viewable area.
Right.
And that's the core on managing large amounts of data. And then there's also another thing which we have in agGrid, which I call virtual pagination, which is not loading the data into the browser. So if you have a slow server, you may not want to bring those 100,000 records over. You just bring the first 4,000, and then you can scroll through them in the virtual way. And then once you hit the bottom of that set, then the grid will request a server for the next 4,000, load up the next page, and then that will be allowed to scroll through those, and that will be done transparently to the user. So, so I'm not sure which one your question was referring to. Is it everything in the browser, but you just render the DOM, or are you talking about paging from the server?
Well, it's interesting the distinguishment that you make between those. I just think of it in terms of the first one, I guess, the virtual scrolling. Right. But it's good to know kind of some of the other variations that are there as well.
Right, yeah, the virtual scrolling, but the problem that solves is that the browser is not good at showing large amounts of data in the DOM, and the DOM should be kept small. So rather than rendering all of the rows at the same time, you just render what's inside the viewable area, which in theory is quite easy. You just put a listener onto the scroll bar, and then as the user scrolls, you work out with a bit of math which rows should be inserted. So you insert those and pull out the others. And the other one that I have, the virtual pagination, that's basically a cache that I've implemented inside the browser. So it's the least recently used cache. It'll keep whatever you configure. It'll keep 5 pages of what you're viewing, and then as the user requests more data, it'll pull it from the server, which is good for 2 reasons. One is if you want to limit the amount of memory that your browser is using. And then the second reason is from a kind of a lazy approach. If your server is slow, so it'll pump out the first 10 or so pages, and then it can be preparing the next pages while the user starts viewing the first set.
I was wondering, maybe it was more about what you said earlier. How do you benchmark your grid?
I'm going to give you an answer that's probably not what you're looking for. My benchmark is feedback from the community.
Okay.
I know when I use MyGrid in work, it goes really, really fast. I know other grids don't because it's obvious when you use them. So for me, I'm not worried about how many frames per second. I'm worried about the user experience. And user experience for me is very good, and the feedback I've been getting from everybody is it's very good as well.
Okay, but when you say that you implemented virtual DOM and it was 25% faster on
Oh,
IE.
right, yeah. For that specific work, when I was spending about 3 weeks, I took the 4 browsers and three. I took 3 browsers, IE, Chrome, and Firefox, and I just put timings inside the grid, and I timed how long it took to redraw an entire page of my test drive, which is the online demo.
Okay. Just wondering because I was reading Angular 2 benchmark design docs the other day, and I was wondering what was your approach. But yeah.
Sorry, if I had a problem with something running slow, then I'd probably invest in stuff like that. But I don't have a problem.
So yeah, when users of agGrid build new system, are they migrating away from other grid, or are they jumping right into yours?
Yeah, that's interesting. People are migrating away. People are pulling agGrid. Sorry, they're pulling other grids out of their applications to put agGrid in instead. And to me, that's actually a big statement. It means that it's not always a this grid or is it that grid. It shows that there's a compelling reason for them to move over. And yeah, I see that as brilliant. And from all types of grids. It's not just one grid in particular, but people are moving from all the different ones, and they're moving for different reasons as well.
Have you done any kind of like comparisons to see what percentage people are using of each?
I'd like to. I don't know if that's possible. Apart from doing manual surveys.
Yeah,
The only
checking GitHub stars maybe.
Yeah, well, that's not fair because I'm new. So if anybody's listening to this, if you can do me a favor and go on to my project and GitHub and give it a star. I know other grids. I've been around for many years. I've been around since April 1st is when I pushed it, so I've only been around for about 6 months. But it's getting there.
That's interesting. I actually thought it was around for longer than that. So that's actually pretty good that you have such a following in such a short time.
Yeah, and so many options as well, because you have a lot of customization in your grid.
Yeah, it's been a very busy year for me. And just one of the things to point out as well, I guess, is this has been done all in my spare time. This is not something I've been working on in my job. We used a grid in my job, but all of the code changes I've been having to do on weekends and evenings. So I've been working 7-day weeks for the last, 5 months.
Is there a reason why your company doesn't give you time to work on it, or you don't have time maybe?
Well, I'd like to keep the distinction separate. It's an open source project, which is mine personally, and if I was to ask permission, well, there is like some leeway. If a feature is required specifically for the job, then I can treat it like an open source project, and I see myself as a contributor. But especially if I'm doing documentation, investigating Angular 2, putting in features for the community, all of that, it's me that's it's the project that's benefiting from it. So it wouldn't be correct to do that in company time.
Okay. One thing I thought was interesting when I was looking over the repo is that you, and maybe I didn't go back through the history, I guess, but right now at least it's in TypeScript, right?
That's right.
So was it always in TypeScript, or did you just convert it recently?
No, it was converted recently. I have been programming TypeScript for about 2 years, on and off, so I've been doing JavaScript and TypeScript. When I started this project off, it was a hobby. It was small, so JavaScript was the easier one to work with a small project. But as the project complexity grew, I kind of saw that where I would be benefiting from strong typing and having a proper object-oriented system in place. So I was thinking towards something, and then when AngularJS was definitely going with TypeScript, then I said, well, that's it. TypeScript's going to be the one. So to me, the switch was when the complexity grew large enough for me to benefit from those features TypeScript brings.
Okay. And then the other question I had was, so because of your approach where you are dealing directly with the DOM, I mean, that's how you get it to be performant, right? And how you make it so that it's not dependent on Angular, like Angular 1 or Angular 2 use it. And those are all benefits. But one thing that's sort of on the flip side of it is sort of a challenge. And I mean, this is just a use case, but it's something that I work a lot with. So like, there is a lot of people who are doing like server-side rendering as well. So when you take that approach, it's something where the grid probably, I would imagine, doesn't work on the server side. But maybe have you tried that, or is it's just like a use case that you don't really care about because most of your customers, people using are, like you said, banks that are just doing single-page apps.
Yeah, it's I should say don't care about it. It's one that I would care about, but it's further down the list. But no, it's not something that I've put serious thought towards. Yeah.
As well. And so, what is the future for agGrid? From here, we talked a lot about how you've kind of grown it up to now, and it sounds like it has really good following, a great product. So where are you going to go from here?
World domination. I think AngularJS Grid. Sorry, not AngularJS. I think agGrid can be the JavaScript grid of the future for the next couple of years. So I think that there will be a compelling reason. Once the word spreads, I think there'll be a compelling reason for people to take it seriously as their primary grid. Compelling reasons being the different environments it supports. Web components are going to be big, AngularJS 2 is going to be big, and the flexibility to move between them is going to be big. I would like that this grid also demonstrates how components can be written, so people will kind of, scratch their beards and go, hold on a sec, this guy is able to use his grid in Angular, it's going to benefit from all the Angular goodness, and it can be used outside of Angular as well. And I think people need to change their opinion on what they pick for their product framework as opposed to what to pick for their component framework. And I think agGrid is in a position to show people how that can be done. So that's where I'd like it to be. And over the next few months as well, I'm going to put a lot of work into, after the frameworks have been done, I'm going to go back and put in all of the features that are potentially missing. So there's things like you can't drag the columns yet, you can't drag rows up and down, you can't export to CSV. There's a few things like that I want to get done. So then when somebody's choosing the grid, that there'll be nothing that they can mark agGrid down on.
That's awesome.
Yeah. I had just one last question. How customizable is agGrid?
It's very, very customizable. Because that was one of the things I didn't really like about the other grids. But firstly, what you can customize, but secondly, how you go about customizing it. How it's customized. One of the things that the other grids didn't do is the separation between the object, the model, and the rendering. And that's one of the features I have in agGrid, is the distinction between value getters and cell renderers. Now, I can't really map that to what other grids do because they just don't seem to do it. But if I give you an example, if, say, in UIGrid, you want to render a cell differently, and in that you also want to do some math. You want to, say it's a weekend cell, and you want to add the values for Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. And your data object doesn't actually have that, doesn't have an attribute mapping to what you want to show. So in UIGrid, I believe, unless it's been changed, you'd have to do all of that inside a template. So your template would need to somehow be responsible for the GUI part and be responsible for working out what you need to show. In agGrid, that's separated out into value getters and then cell renderers. The job of the value getter is to work out the value that should be shown in that cell. So it will add the 5 numbers together and return back a number result. And then that number result will be passed to the cell renderer, which you can provide yourself, or you can use the default, and then the cell renderer will render that in a certain way. The reason why that's important is that when you break the value getter out, then that value can be reused in the filters and in sorting and also in expressions. It can be used from someplace else. And it also allows you to break out the cell rendering. So you can have a cell renderer for, say, currency, and then you can reuse that against different instances where that currency renderer will be used. So I believe if you're to achieve the same thing in UIGrid, you'd have to prepare all of the values up front and make sure that all those values are already in your data object, and not allow you to do that kind of work inside the grid. I found that very powerful in my job because we've got a lot of complex expressions where it's almost, if you see our grid definitions, they're almost like spreadsheets, in that there's a lot of work going on there. The data comes back a certain way from the server, and then the grid manipulates it even further like a spreadsheet. All of that is done without any HTML markup. Also, styling of the grid, if a number is negative and you need to show it in red or flash a background, all of that is done through the configuration as well, all through what I call the grid options, and it's all done in what can be JSON and stored down with no HTML. So to achieve those types of things in UIGrid, you need to be mixing markup with the logic of the grid. I'm not sure if I explained that very well. Sounded a bit mixed up in my mind when I was saying it. But if you're listening to this, just take away that there's a separation between the rendering and the getting of the values, and that's something that's very powerful. So if that's tweaked your interest, then I recommend you get onto the website and take a look at it closer.
No, that makes sense to me, and I like the idea in general of having a highly configurable library that you're able to use that has kind of a smart set of defaults and can fit into different scenarios that come up, and that's what it sounds like agGrid has done. One last thing that I had, you mentioned some of the comparison with UIGrid. Have you ever kind of reached out to the team and the people that support UIGrid to see whether there's like a collaboration? Meaning, probably not now since you're kind of in a different, gone down a different path. But I'm talking about like kind of earlier on when you were trying out all these things, like instead of let me build a new one, maybe you could like latch on to an existing one like UIGrid and actually alter what they've been doing. Did you try that at all, or were you just it's going to be easier for me to just do my own thing?
It would have been easier for me to do my own thing. Gotcha. Like if there's, I got the core of my grid working in 2 weeks. It would have taken me 2 weeks just to say hello. And I think what I have, even from the inception, like UIGrid is textbook AngularJS, and I don't believe that's how you should be writing components. So I don't think we would have gotten off to a good start.
Yeah, sure, it is a different approach, for sure, yeah, from what you said. So that makes sense. Okay, so we've gone over a lot of questions, but is there something that we haven't covered that you'd love to make sure that the community knows as well?
Well, I think I would say that the response I got from the community has all been positive. Every single person that has gotten in touch has given me positive feedback. I've not received anybody that said they've tried UIGrid and they ripped it out to go someplace else. That hasn't happened. And people can check the bulletin boards, they can check the GitHub messages. It's just been all positive. It's been all positive. So if you're having any thoughts about a different grid, or if you're having any concerns with Angular 2 and what grid you'd use for Angular 2, then I'd recommend you just check out agGrid, have a look at it, and then make your own mind up.
That's awesome. Okay. Let's get right to picks. So Amy, why don't you start off?
Sure. I don't think I've picked this before, but my pick this week was going to be another very quick podcast. It's 5 minutes of JavaScript. So it's put on by the people at Code School. They used to have I think they still have a Ruby one, so now there's a JavaScript one. And actually, Jeff, you should listen because the survey that you and Patrick did was mentioned on it, the episode last week.
Oh,
so
okay.
That's why I had to have that as my pick this week. But it's good because it's just 5 minutes, so just gives you like some popular stuff that week to check out. And that's my pick for this week.
Excellent. All right, Oliver.
I started working on Angular 2, to rework on Angular 2 last week because I tried it earlier, but it was too much unstable. And now Angular just announced that the API is stable, and they will be working on documentation. So I started researching Angular 2 resources because the documentation is not good yet. And I found this GitHub repo named Angular 2 Education, as I will link, and I picked 3 starters. One is from Kozlovsky, I don't know how to say his name, Pavel Kozlovsky. Yeah. It's one of the oldest. It was already up in March, I think, when they announced the alpha. So yeah, this one is interesting. The next one is Angular 2 Webpack Starter by Patrick James, and it's been really good. And it's a big project. You can use it to start, but you can also use it to look at really core stuff from the library. And the last one is a new one by John Papa that he just tweeted about, which is Angular 2 Go, and this one is really simple. If you want to start, I think it's a good one if you want something really simple. So I will put the link in the Hangout.
Cool. Thanks, Oliver. I'll go next. I have 2 picks. The first one next week is Angular Remote Conf. Kent is going to be speaking at it. I'm going to be speaking at it, and a bunch of other people. So if you haven't already gotten your tickets, it's relatively cheap, and there's going to be a lot of great talks, fully remote. So definitely do that. And then the other pick that I had was AWS. One of their services, SES, for simple email service. I've used a bunch of different email services before, most recently Mandrill, and I think like a dozen other different ones.
Why not SparkPost?
Which one?
Why not SparkPost?
I have not used SparkPost. I'll plug them as well.
You need to give them a shot.
The thing I like about SES, which I'll definitely check out in SparkPost as well, is just the API for it is kind of in line with what like my mindset. I feel like the API for some other email services is just isn't user friendly or developer friendly enough. So definitely check out both of those. I'll put up links for both SparkPost and SES in the Hangout. And finally, let's talk. Go to Niall.
I just ask people again to start a project on GitHub, agGrid or Angular Grid on GitHub. That's all.
Awesome. Thank you, Niall, so much for being here. We really appreciate you taking your time. Hope everyone had fun, and we will see you next week for Minko talking about immutability. Amy, did you have something?
Yep, one more thing. So you mentioned Angular Remote Conf. Just to let everybody know, if they still want tickets, you can use that code AngularAir, and you'll get 20% off your ticket.
Thank you, Amy, very much. All right, guys. See you next week. Have a good one.
See you.